The first time I saw the barbed wire surrounding my mom's cabin, I thought it was some kind of prank. Then I saw the private property keep out signs, the surveillance cameras, and the smug faces of the HOA board members standing nearby. They had no idea who they were messing with. The cabin sat nestled in the vast, untouched beauty of Montana's hills, a place where my mother had always found her peace. It wasn't just a home, it was her fortress, her escape from the exhausting political world she ruled over as the state's mayor. She had built this place with her own hands, back before politics had swallowed her life whole. My father had left when I was just a kid, but my mother, she had never backed down from anything. This land was her reminder that she could carve out her own space in a world that constantly tried to put her in a box. But now, standing at the dirt road that led up to the cabin, all I saw was metal fencing. Barbed wire stretched tightly around the entire perimeter like a military blockade. Large trespassers will be prosecuted. Signs were drilled into trees, and a security camera blinked from a post near the gate. It looked like a prison. I stepped out of my car, my boots crunching against the gravel. A group of men stood by a black SUV, watching me like I was an intruder on my own property. "What the hell is this?" I demanded, my voice sharp with disbelief. A wiry man in a cheap suit and polished shoes stepped forward. He had a clipboard in one hand and the kind of smirk that made my blood boil. "This property has been secured due to multiple HOA violations," he said smoothly. I frowned. "HOA? This cabin isn't part of any HOA." The man tilted his head as if I was some clueless fool. "As of last month, a majority vote expanded the association's jurisdiction. All homeowners in the extended region are now subject to our regulations." I stared at him, my fingers curling into fists. "You mean to tell me that some random vote lets you take over private land that was never part of your HOA in the first place?" He shrugged. "It was a democratic decision." Democratic, right. More like a backroom deal cooked up by a bunch of power-hungry board members who thought they could push people around. I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "Where's the official notice?" The man flipped through his clipboard and produced a stapled document. I yanked it from his hands and scanned it. The HOA had indeed expanded their jurisdiction by a single vote, but the whole thing reeked of corruption. There were no official state signatures, no confirmation of approval from county offices, just a flimsy letter with HOA letterhead claiming control. "This isn't legal," I snapped. He smiled, the kind of smile that people wear when they think they've won. "Take it up with the board." I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. These people had no idea what they had just stepped into. I pulled out my phone and took pictures of everything. The barbed wire, the signs, the smug faces of the enforcers. If they thought my mother was going to roll over and accept this, they were in for the shock of their lives. The history of the cabin. As I drove back to town, my thoughts raced. This cabin wasn't just another house. It was a part of my mother's legacy, the only place she had ever truly called her own. She had bought this land before she was ever a politician, back when she was just Evelyn Carter, a single mother trying to make something out of nothing. She had built it with her bare hands, learned how to use a hammer, how to lay down timber, how to work through the exhaustion of long nights and freezing winters. It was more than wood and stone. It was her proof to herself and to the world that she didn't need anyone's approval to survive. And now, some HOA thought they could take that from her. Not a damn chance. My mom, the woman they didn't see. Coming people saw my mother as a politician, a leader, a woman who fought battles in boardrooms and on the campaign trail. But they didn't know the other side of her. They didn't know the Evelyn Carter who grew up dirt poor, who worked 3 jobs just to put food on the table. They didn't know the woman who once chased off a group of real estate developers with nothing but her words and a steely gaze. They didn't know the woman who never, ever backed down. The HOA had played their hand, thinking she was just another homeowner. They had no idea they had just declared war on a woman who had spent her whole life fighting. I smirked as I reached for my phone and dialed her number. "Mom," I said, my voice steady with the storm building inside me. "We've got a problem." A pause, then her voice, sharp as steel. Tell me everything. The moment my mom heard what had happened, her silence was more terrifying than if she had started yelling. Evelyn Carter wasn't the kind of woman who lost her temper. She didn't scream, didn't lash out. Instead, she let silence settle like a cold weight before she spoke. Sharp, measured, deadly. "I'll be there in 2 hours," she said, and then the line went dead. That's when I knew the HOA had made the biggest mistake of their lives. Evelyn Carter arrived. 2 hours later, my mom's black SUV roared up the winding dirt road, dust kicking up behind her like a storm. She stepped out, dressed in a crisp navy suit, her usual attire for business meetings and political battles. But there was something about the way she stood, feet planted firmly, shoulders squared, that made even the wind seem to still around her. I'd seen her like this before, when she went head-to-head with billionaires trying to bulldoze historic neighborhoods, when she shut down corrupt state officials without so much as raising her voice. She was in war mode. She walked up to the barbed wire fence, examining the "Trespassers will be prosecuted" signs with the kind of gaze that could peel paint off a wall. I watched as the same wiry man with the clipboard, the one who had smirked at me earlier, stepped forward, looking far less confident now. "Mayor Carter," he said, clearing his throat. I wasn't aware you were." "That's obvious," she interrupted, her voice cool and composed. "Because if you had been, you would have known this stunt was a very bad idea." The man swallowed hard. "This land is now under the jurisdiction of the HOA. You're legally required to comply with—" She raised a hand, and he stopped mid-sentence. "Let me explain something," she said. "This land was purchased outright, free and clear, before your HOA even existed. It has never fallen under your governance, and it never will." "But," she held up the document they had given me earlier, flipping through the pages as if they were beneath her concern. "This is nothing more than a self-serving, unofficial expansion. There are no legal county approvals, no verified jurisdictional agreements. In fact," she pulled out her phone and scrolled through a document. "According to the Montana State Property Code, this type of jurisdictional overreach is a direct violation of private property rights." I crossed my arms, smirking as the color drained from the man's face. "We had a vote," he muttered. "The community agreed. Your vote is meaningless without state-level approval." She took a step closer. "Tell me, did you really think you could bulldoze my land without doing your homework? That you could rewrite property laws overnight?" The man opened and closed his mouth like a fish gasping for air. She turned to me. "Call the sheriff." He blanched. "Wait, that won't be necessary." "It absolutely is," she said, eyes locked onto him. "You installed barbed wire on private land without consent. That's criminal trespassing. The HOA's real agenda." An hour later, the sheriff arrived, and it didn't take long to confirm what we already knew. The HOA had no legal authority over the cabin. The barbed wire came down that same evening, and the men who had set it up were forced to pack up and leave. But I knew this wasn't over. HOAs didn't just pull stunts like this without a bigger plan. Something didn't add up. So I did what my mother had taught me. I dug deeper. I spent the next few days researching the HOA board members, cross-referencing their financial ties, their land purchases, anything that might explain why they were so eager to seize control of my mom's property. And that's when I found it. A real estate development plan. Buried in county records was a proposal submitted months ago for a luxury resort right where my mother's cabin stood. The HOA wasn't just about rules and regulations. They were working with the developer, trying to force out homeowners so they could flip the land for millions. They thought my mother was just another name on their list. They had no idea she was about to destroy everything they had built. My mother had dealt with corrupt politicians, backdoor deals, and power-hungry executives her entire career. But this was personal. The HOA thought they were playing chess, but they hadn't realized they were up against a grandmaster. As I stared at the development proposal on my laptop screen, my heart pounded. The plans were ambitious, too ambitious for some small-town HOA to handle alone. This was bigger than just a few greedy board members. Someone with real money was pulling the strings. I printed everything I found and handed it to my mother that evening. She skimmed the papers with a practiced eye, her expression unreadable. But I knew her well enough to recognize the small, satisfied nod she gave at the end. She had everything she needed to bring them down. The truth comes to light. The next morning, she made a few calls. First, she contacted the county records office to verify whether the development project had been officially approved. It hadn't. Then she called the state attorney's office and had them look into potential legal violations. Within hours, we had confirmation. The HOA had knowingly forged documents, lied about their jurisdiction, and attempted to illegally seize private land. But my mother wasn't just going to stop them, she was going to expose them. The press conference. A day later, she held a press conference in front of the county courthouse. The local and state media showed up in full force, cameras flashing, microphones poised. She stood at the podium, composed as ever, her voice calm but filled with authority. For years, the people of this community have trusted their homeowners association to act in their best interest, she began. But behind closed doors, certain board members have been working with developers to force homeowners off their land. A murmur swept through the crowd. She held up a file. This is a legally binding contract, one that was never disclosed to the homeowners affected by these changes. It outlines plans to construct a luxury resort without approval from the county or the state. The reporters fired off questions. Who's behind this? What happens next? My mother smiled. A dangerous smile. As of this morning, I have formally requested a full state investigation into this HOA, its leadership, and its financial backers. Anyone found guilty of fraud, illegal land seizure, or coercion will be held accountable. The HOA collapses. The fallout was swift and brutal. Within 2 weeks, half of the HOA board had resigned, and the remaining members were under investigation for fraud. The development project was shut down, and every attempt to expand the HOA's control over private properties was reversed. And just like that, the fortress they had built to steal land and power crumbled. The cabin stands tall. A month later, I drove up to my mother's cabin again. The barbed wire was gone, the signs were gone, and in their place, the land looked just as it always had, untouched, free, and belonging to the woman who had fought for it. I found my mother sitting on the porch, sipping her coffee, looking out at the mountains like she always did. They really thought they could take this from you, I said, shaking my head. She smirked, taking a slow sip. They always do. We sat there for a while, listening to the wind rustle through the trees. The HOA had underestimated the wrong woman, and they had paid the price. For weeks after the scandal broke, the town was buzzing. The HOA, once an untouchable force in the community, had been shattered beyond repair. Neighbors who had once feared fines and threats now walked with their heads high, their properties no longer under the grip of a corrupt board. Some even knocked on my mother's door just to thank her. But for my mother, this wasn't about gratitude. It was about principle. Because if you let people like that win, they don't just take your land. They take everything. The real power players. As the dust settled, we dug deeper into the money trail. The HOA wasn't just acting alone, they were being funded. A billionaire real estate tycoon from California had been quietly buying land in our state, using HOA expansions as a tool to squeeze people out. He'd done this before, in multiple towns, across multiple states. My mother wasn't about to let him get away with it. She took her case straight to the governor's office. Within days, state lawmakers were drafting a bill to restrict HOA power, ensuring that no homeowner could be forced under HOA control without their consent. The fight that started with my mother's cabin, it turned into a statewide movement. The final strike. While the law worked its way through the system, my mother had one last card to play. She filed a personal lawsuit against the HOA's former president, the wiry man with the clipboard who had tried to smirk his way through our first encounter. When served with the lawsuit, the man's bravado crumbled. Under pressure, he flipped, exposing every backroom deal, every illegal vote, every payoff. And with his testimony, the billionaire developer was dragged into the spotlight. By the time the dust settled, the developer's empire had taken a massive financial hit. The HOA was permanently dissolved, and my mother's cabin, untouched, unchallenged, unbreakable, a legacy that stands. Months later, my mother and I sat on the same porch, looking out at the same mountains. Everything was quiet now. No barbed wire, no cameras, no threats, just peace. She turned to me, her eyes thoughtful. "People think power is about control," she said. "But real power, it's knowing when to stand your ground." I nodded, feeling the weight of everything we had just fought through. The HOA had thought they were untouchable. They had thought they could take whatever they wanted. But they had made one fatal mistake. They had underestimated a woman who never backed down. And because of that, they lost everything.